Our second reading today comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, 24 through 30 and 36 through 40. It's the parable of weeds among the wheat, and Jesus explaining of that parable. Let's listen for God's word to us in Matthew 13. Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field, but while everyone was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, "Master, did you not sow good wheat seed in the field? Where then did these weeds come from?" He answered, "An enemy has done this." The slave said to him, "Then, do you want us to go out and gather them?" He replied, "No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest, and at the harvest time I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles for burning, but gather the wheat into my barn." Then Jesus explains. Then he left the crowds and went into a house. The disciples approached him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." He answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with the fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen." The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. There are many ways to look at a parable, but one way to look at this parable is to see how it spotlights our inevitable human preoccupation with drawing lines, dividing people up into who's in and who's out, wheat and weeds. Now, this is not a new phenomenon, obviously, and not unique to a church environment. Although the parable we just read is an agricultural metaphor, it applies at multiple levels. Theologian Tom Long says it can be interpreted or applies at three levels. First, to the ministry of Jesus himself. Second, to the life of the church. And then third, to the future judgment at the end of the world. The parable applies to any one or all three of these, to the ministry of Jesus, the life of the church, the end time judgment. Three ways we can gain understanding from this parable of wheat and weeds. First then, relating to the ministry of Jesus himself. No doubt the disciples and other of the first followers of Jesus would have heard these words and immediately think of those weeds, our opponents to Jesus. They would immediately think of his opponents' persistent criticism and challenges and hostility in the midst of his ministry. These opponents did not really point out true flaws or deficits in his message, but they were working as his enemy for the devil. Quote, "An enemy, the devil, has done this," the householder says, meaning the presence of weeds in the field. It would have real-time implications for the first disciples, seeing people as wheat and weeds in their time, in their lives. In our time, we tend to focus on the second element of the meaning of the life of the church and our own lives in the church. Like that field which grows both healthy wheat and destructive weeds. The church really is a mixed bag. If we are realistic, we will admit we have both wheat and weeds. Like the slaves of the household, there are those who want to immediately weed out those dangerous, unwanted elements, pull those perceived as weeds now. Note, we are somehow locked into transferring this first century agricultural metaphor into modern times. It is like a soybean field, which must be cleansed of every type of plant other than the soybean. Now, those of us who work in agriculture can relate to this, seeing that clean soybean field out there. I remarked to my spouse on a number of those as we traveled this summer across Iowa, looking at bean fields there. It's like a soybean field which must be cleansed of every other plant. We plant cover crops, we will spray, we may even walk the rows with a hoe if we have to make sure that we have clean beans. This is not all about economics. There are certainly judgment involved here. Clean beans means I am a good farmer. My neighbors, anyone who passes by, knows that I am a good farmer. Not like those negligent ones with weeds in their beans. What sinners they are. Do we have this metaphor stuck in our heads? Clean rows of beans means godliness? I would contend that this clean beans is exactly the wrong interpretation of this metaphor to have stuck in our heads. To me, it's both dangerous and unbiblical. Yet in our modern church, we see where matters of behavior and lifestyle, matters of theology and biblical interpretation become the basis for litmus tests of all kinds of varieties. What behavior is accepted or rejected? Who is a weed? Who is the chosen plant? Now, this is not a conservative versus liberal or reform versus non-reform problem. All elements of our different church expressions are troubled by how broadly or how narrowly we would draw the boundaries of the contemporary church. Whom can we afford to let in? And who must remain out? Who is accepted by God and why? Who is not accepted by God and why not? In the very asking of such questions, we so often assume it is our job to draw the line, to spray the herbicide that will define who the church will welcome. We try to speak for God. This potential misuse of this parable carries forward from biblical times the definition of sin in yet another way. Gary Plasuo challenges this in terms of change, or maybe lack of change in some cases, in what he calls theological anthropology. Let me say that again, I got through it pretty well. Theological anthropology. Now, perhaps I should have consulted Scott McGraw, our professor of anthropology, on this, but the premise of from the theologian is that the first century community would see itself as made up fundamentally of one of two types of persons. One was a child of God, and the other was a child of Satan. You were a sheep or a goat, a disciple of Christ or a disciple of the evil one. Clean and clear binary split, wheat or wheat, one or the other. If you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, it's not that simple. You are part of a post-Freudian world which does not tend to divide the whole person so neatly. We see mixed motivations, the noble and the base, in each person. Maybe proportioned differently, but each of us are a mixed bag. That would be a common theological anthropology of our day. It may be both more comfortable and fruitful for us to think of each Christian individual as a mixture of wheat and weed, of holy and unholy, of potentially fruitful and potentially destructive, a mix that can change over time. Understanding their ancient kind of anthropology might help us understand those slaves who wanted to just pull those darn weeds and burn them. They are confident that without further delay, they can assure a clean harvest. Pull those weeds, burn those weeds, settle things forever. The problem of who is in and who is out is solved. However, Matthew, as he tells the story, as the master in this parable, has a greater wisdom. He says, no. For gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest, he says, because one cannot always tell about these plants. Theodore Woodlaw points out that there is a strategy in these words of restraint, a strategy that pushes away from the premature clarity regarding such matters of discernment and makes room instead for a holy and purposeful ambiguity, a purposeful uncertainty. This is not a vague or ungrounded whatever kind of ambiguity, but the ambiguity that is both wise and intentional. Not a I don't care discernment, but rather I do care discernment. I care enough to make the effort to discern with you, to discern what part of you and what part of me is wheat and what part is weed. Yet still in our impatient world, we often want to bring matters to head and immediately determine whether others are in or out. But God, who is glimpsed in this parable, models for us an infinitely patient God that frees us to get on with the crucial business of loving, or at least living with each other. In this space we create by such patience, interesting change can happen. It is not just the other that may be changed. We may experience a larger reality. In this sense, in which we are reborn, not just once, but over and over again. Weeds can become wheat. This transformation might just happen. Now, let me give you a practical example to hang this on. Some years back in the spring, Yvonne and I went to one of those, equivalent of one of the Oakland nursery type places. And what I saw there were people, crazy people, paying big bucks for pots of weeds. Weeds that I had spent sweltering summer afternoons digging out of our pasture. Not harvesting, just digging them out to get rid of them. And there they were paying big bucks for those crazy people. Now today, I look at those pots and say to myself, my brothers and sisters in green industry of agriculture are pretty darn shrewd. And maybe those plants do look kind of pretty in the right environment. I know for sure they are hardy plants. Maybe my anthropology of plants has evolved a bit. Maybe weeds can become or are wheat. Maybe I have seen that for myself. This picture still fits Tom Long's third level, the end time judgment. A blessed mixture of weeds and wheat growing together until the harvest is not just a hint of the character of the faithful church in our time, but a hint of the future judgment at the end of time as we know it. At this third level, the parable leads us to God who does not merely tolerate endlessly a world that is a mixture of good and evil, faith and faithfulness, triumph and tragedy, but who finally, in God's own time, acts both to judge and to redeem the world. In the meantime, Christians believe that for the sake of this hurting and impatient world, God sent his only Son to be our model of life and behavior. We believe that the Son gave his life that we may have grace, the forgiveness of sins. We believe that we will come again at such time as he will come again at such time as well be revealed in its fullness. Meanwhile, his realm is thriving in us, around us, and even miraculously sometimes through us. God is pleased to let it all grow together until the harvest. Well, I was thinking a bit about what I did and did not want you to take away from this sermon. First, what you should not take away. This is not an excuse to not weed or flower gardens or flower beds. Please avoid the heat of the day in doing that, however. It's not an excuse to make judgments, good or bad, about Jerry Donovan and who's farming his land, whoever's farming his land, when you drive by his soybean field. He looked pretty good this morning, by the way. Not an excuse to make judgments about those people who pay big bucks for weeds at Oakland nurseries. The parable's ending affirms that there is one with a capital O, one who is stronger and smarter than the weed-sowing enemy. There is God. God, not the individual, not the church. God will sort out the good from the bad. That may sound harsh or to our tolerant, enlightened ears, but the harvest time judgment is the ultimate good news. In a world where seeds of hatred and injustice are sown, the parable affirms unequivocally that God is still in charge. As an old hymn proclaims, though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. Perhaps Tom Long got it right when he said that this parable applied at those three different levels. First, obviously, to the ministry of Jesus himself in his time. Then this parable applies to the life of the church and to our lives as individuals. Then this parable applies to the future judgment at the end of the world. We're thinking about this message, embedded in the parable of wheat and weeds. Amen.